Chapter 16. I shook my head to clear it. This was all too much. I returned to the sink and put the empty bottle into the garbage container. My mind started activating again, and I realized I should have gone after Cheryl. I went to get my jacket and boots, and then I had to look for my house keys. They weren't in my purse, and I couldn't remember where I had put them. It was stupid to think of such things, but my mind was still a muddle. The closest bus stop was at Watt Street, so I walked in that direction. I reached the bus stop, but there was no sign of Cheryl. I went back towards Henderson. I was sure that if Cheryl had intended to take a bus, she would have gotten one by now. Just in case, I waited at the bus stop for the next downtown bus and got on. I tried looking out both sides of the window, but with it being dark outside and lighted inside, plus the condensation on the windows, I couldn't see the sidewalks very well. I got off in front of the city hall and decided to walk back home, over the Nairn Bridge and all. That meant the main street strip. I walked on the north side because there were more people on that side. If Cheryl were among these people, I could spot her. But I walked all the way home without running into her. I couldn't sleep that night. The wind had picked up outside, and I was sure there was a blizzard going on out there. Mixed in were the noises of the house. All those creakings one doesn't notice during the day. I listened to them, deciphering what made them, and several times I thought Cheryl had returned. I got up more than once and went upstairs to check her room. The next morning, I got up tired. I thought perhaps I had made too big of a deal the night before, when I worried about never seeing Cheryl again. Nonetheless, I called where she worked and found out that she had quit a few months back. I called the Friendship Center, but the person who answered didn't know Cheryl. I made coffee. I spent most of the day waiting and worrying. When my employer from the agency called to asking if I wanted to start a job Monday, I said no, that I'd be taking some time off again. At 4:30, Roger phoned to say that he was going to pick me up in an hour. We were supposed to go out for supper, but I had forgotten. Oh, Roger, I can't go. Cheryl left last night. I don't know where she is. She's not going to come back. Well, April, Cheryl has been away overnight before. Why are you so worried? We quarreled. She was drinking heavily. She told me everything, Roger. All the things that have been bothering her. I have to find her. Okay, we'll have supper and then we'll go look for her, all right? You don't have to come with me. I don't even know where to begin. I'll come with you. Don't worry, April. We'll find her. While I waited for Roger, I decided we could go down to the Friendship Center and talk to anyone who might know where Cheryl might be. I tried to remember the places Cheryl had mentioned in the past. Was it Carlos or was it the name of a beer? I got my coat and my boots on and waited for Roger. I went back to the kitchen and in the phone book. There was a place called the Carlos. That was it. I noted the address. Since it was Friday night, I thought we might even find Nancy. I cursed myself for not even taking more interest in Cheryl's friends. I didn't even know Nancy's last name. After we had a quick supper, we went to the center. A few people said they knew Cheryl, but they hadn't seen her for the past couple of months. From there, we drove down Main Street over to Carlos, which was on Carlton. There was a lineup of people waiting to get in, different types of people, and it reminded me of the Hungry Eye, my crowd once. When Roger and I got in, we looked over the crowd. Already there was a smoky haze hanging over everyone's head. Music was blasting from the amplifiers. The way we were dressed, Roger and I were obviously out of place. We ordered a drink, but we were barely able to talk because of the noise. I looked for Cheryl or Nancy. I even felt I'd be able to tell who Mark was if I saw him. I wondered if this is where they all still hung out. On the other side of the room, there was a girl who reminded me of Sylvia Grinnan. I couldn't see clearly because of the dimly lit, smoky atmosphere. People kept passing between us, and sometimes I was sure it was Sylvia, and then I wasn't sure. I studied the other people at her table. They were all white. Mark, as far as I knew, was Métis. When the band took a break, Roger asked me if I recognized any of Cheryl's friends. I said I didn't, and we might as well leave. We drove around for a while, up and down the downtown streets, and as we searched the faces for Cheryl's, we were unsuccessful. We returned to my place, and I went upstairs to see if she had returned, but she hadn't. We took our coffee into the living room, and I turned the television set on. You know, Roger, I'm to blame. No, I'm not into the self-blaming thing. It's just I wanted her to have all these good memories of our parents. I always told her only the good things that happened when we lived with them. I knew they had drinking problems. That's why we were taken away. I should have told her when I gave her those names. I should have told her that our parents were alcoholics, but I didn't. I just gave her the stuff and hoped her search would come to an end. And when she went out and found our father and found that he was an old drunk, I'm sure she never told me all these things she discovered because she felt she had to protect me from the truth. She carried that around with her all alone. not wanting to share her problems, and I knew about it. Well, not the part about our mother committing suicide. So many lies to protect, and in the end, they destroy anyway. I just can't understand why all that would have such an adverse effect on her, unless, unless what? Well, maybe she just used these things as an excuse to start drinking. Maybe she was an alcoholic all along, and maybe she needed some real good reason to start into it. Do you think that's possible? I guess anything is possible, but Cheryl doesn't sound like the type of person who would use that as an excuse. The reasons for drinking can be very complicated. Sometimes I think if we really were white, we wouldn't have all these complications in our lives. I'd just be a wife, maybe a working mother, just an ordinary person. You know what I mean? There probably wouldn't be any problem with alcoholism. Our lives would be so different. But as it is, I lie and I protect her, and she lies to protect me, and we both lose out. I don't know. If I was more like her or she was more like me, maybe we wouldn't have pulled apart. Maybe that's what's been wrong. You've both pulled in different directions. Cheryl has identified with the Indian people and all the wrongs that have been done to them. And you, having identified with the white people, well, she's taken everything she's felt out on you. Earlier, when you told me the things she used to say when she was drunk, well, she wouldn't believe them herself when she was sober. Being drunk gives one false courage. Cheryl never needed false courage. She was always spunky enough. She had courage. I think from what you've told me, Cheryl saw you in a superior white role. You supplied her with all her needs. You stayed in Winnipeg to help her, to be by her side. You stressed that she can depend on you, right? Well, I am her big sister. Maybe you could have told her that you needed her help from her, or at least not made it so clear that you were in charge. People need to feel that they are needed and worthwhile. I'd say Cheryl has a very low self-image right now. Drinking helps wipe out that image, and she can't let herself become sober because it hurts when she's sober. So she drinks again. I kind of figured something like that. I wanted her to go to bed and sleep off the alcohol. I wanted for us to really talk when she was completely sober. The weeks passed and Roger and I continued to look for Cheryl. She never had come back to the house. Every day when I get home, I'd look in her room and everything was always just as it had been that first night. We returned to Carlos regularly, but always without any luck. Sometimes we'd drive around and I'd spot someone who I was sure was Cheryl. I'd get Roger to park the car and I'd jump out and go after that person. But when the woman would turn around, my excitement would turn to disappointment because it was never Cheryl. The month of April brought erratic temperatures. Some days were warm enough to tempt impatient women into their shorts. The nights brought back the cold temperatures, though, sometimes even below freezing. April 18th, 1973, was a cold, rainy day, my birthday. I stayed home hoping Cheryl would remember and come home. But she didn't. Roger and I celebrated alone. 10 days later, it was the same kind of dismal day. The winds started early in the afternoon, first in short bursts, as if gathering momentum for the gales that would soon follow. It had drizzled off and on for the previous several days. Since it was Saturday, Roger and I had been out combing the city, more specifically, the hotels. We'd even gone to all the hotels along Main Street. The rain began to fall even more heavily as the day wore on, and the wind had also picked up. Late in the afternoon, we decided to call it quits after I had rushed out into the rain, thinking a stranger had been Cheryl. When we got to my place, I was still soaked to the bone. I felt so discouraged. While I changed, Roger made us some coffee. Then we sat in the living room, just listening to the steady pelting of the rain against the windows. I wonder what Roger was thinking. Maybe he thought I wasn't worth all the trouble and aggravation. Maybe he wanted to call it quits with me, but not at this time because of Cheryl. I sighed. What's the matter? He asked. Oh, nothing. Just wondering about all the trouble I put you to and how much gas you have used up. Well, it's not enough and it won't be until we find Cheryl. You really and truly don't mind? In spite of her current problems, I think Cheryl's quite a person and she is your sister. I laid my head on his lap reassured. It felt so good to be near Roger. It seemed hard to believe that I had held him away for so long. I would have been completely content except for Cheryl. Suddenly the phone rang, exploding into the stillness of the house. I jumped. By the second ring, I got there and I picked up the receiver. Hello? Is this April? Yes. I don't know if you remember me. It's Nancy. Cheryl's been staying with me. Nancy's voice sounded shaky. I remember you. What about Cheryl? Is she okay? I said anxiously, shooting out the questions. She just left here. I didn't want her to go. She seems okay, but in a funny way. I wanted her to stay here. But she said she had to go. She said goodbye to me, as if she weren't going to see me again. Nancy sniffled. Do you know where she was going? No, and I couldn't go after her because I've been sick the past couple of days, and I'm not dressed. My mom thinks she's going to do something terrible. My mom's the one who told me to call you. Maybe you can do something. I'm so worried. Oh no. I leaned against the wall. My voice was barely a whisper. Roger was at my side, and then he took the receiver from me. What's going on? He asked Nancy. He listened to her for a few minutes and then asked for her address. Then he asked some questions about Cheryl, what Cheryl was wearing. When he hung up, he immediately called the police. He explained the situation and gave them Nancy's address and told them we'd meet them there. It was still raining, but not as heavily, as we drove to the address on Henry Avenue. There were a number of look-alike run-down shacks, and we found Nancy's house among them. Nancy opened the door before we could knock. Anything new? Roger asked immediately. No, I just didn't know how to stop her, Nancy sobbed. It's all right, Nancy, don't worry. We called the police and I'm sure everything's going to be okay. Thank you for calling me. What I really wanted to say to her was that she should have called me a lot earlier, but she looked so sorrowful. Let's drive around and see if we can spot her, Roger suggested. We had pulled away when Roger noticed a police car arrive and stop in front of Nancy's house. He braked and put the car in reverse. We both got out and walked back to the car. I was so hopeful they had found her. I looked in the back of the car for Cheryl, but there was no Cheryl. Roger exchanged some words with the officer, who then turned and asked if I had the vaguest idea where she might have gone. No, I don't. We've been looking for her, and all this time she was here. If only Nancy had called us before this. Now I just don't know where she could be. And you know what our poor, dear mother did? She jumped off the Louise Bridge, is what she did. She committed suicide. Cheryl's words flashed across my mind. She jumped off the Louise Bridge, I said out loud. What's that? Roger asked. Our mother killed herself by jumping off the Louise Bridge. Didn't I tell you that? No, you just said that she did it. You didn't say, never mind, let's go there. Roger briefly explained the situation to the officer, and he agreed to drive over the bridge to check it out. Roger and I had only jumped in the car and followed the police cruiser. It was only a few minutes' ride, but it seemed to take a lifetime. Why doesn't he put on his flashers or siren on, for crying out loud? I said impatiently as we stopped at a red light on Main Street. My eyes were still combing the sidewalks. Maybe she had stopped for a drink someplace. Maybe she had gone back home. Maybe her goodbye to Nancy meant she was going to move back home. Oh, I'd give her such a big hug if that's what she had done. Finally, we reached the Louise Bridge. I could see some figures on the bridge waving towards the police car. Roger parked behind the cruiser. I jumped out into the rain, now coming down in torrents, and ran to where the police officer was talking to two strangers on the bridge. Not 5 minutes ago, one was saying. She just stood up on the railing, I tell you, and jumped off. Ask Dan here. He was with me. We both saw it. We tried to stop it, officer. We slammed on the brakes, but we couldn't get there in time. Christ, 1 minute she was standing there balancing, and the next, nothing. Why would she want to do a thing like that? Those Indians are always killing themselves. If they aren't shooting each other on the reserves, it's this. Holy jumpin' Jesus Christ, what a night this has been. And now this. I tell you, it's unbelievable. I was looking down into the waters, looking for a body. It was too dark to see anything, too murky. The man's word rung in my ears. She was my sister, mister, I said. What did he know? Someday, maybe, I could explain to people like him why they did it. Roger placed his arms around me. The man mumbled an apology, said he didn't know. I was crying. My tears were mixed with the rain, and they dropped down to where Cheryl was, in that murky water I had once loved to watch. Now I watched, hoping that Cheryl was somewhere down there alive. But I knew there was no hope. Not for Cheryl. Not anymore. I ached inside. I wanted to let loose my tears. I felt like sobbing, screaming, and wailing, but I just stood there, using the railing for support, hiding the agony I felt. The agony of being too late. Always too late. After answering some questions for the police officer, Roger and I drove back to Nancy's house. When she had opened the door, she saw right away from my expression that the worst had happened. She burst into tears. Her mother saw Nancy begin to cry and walked over and put her arm around her and hugged her. Then she came over to me, a complete stranger, and also gave me a comforting hug. Roger quickly and briefly explained what had happened. Well, Nancy's mother busied herself making tea. She said Cheryl was like a daughter, you know. She was such a good person. She helped Nancy, you know. Yeah, whenever I needed help, she was there. Nancy started sobbing again. But between sobs, she continued. Sometimes when we needed money, Cheryl would give it to us. She never made us feel like we owed her, you know? And when I would get depressed, Cheryl would cheer me up, make me laugh. Cheryl would buy groceries, Nancy's mother said, and she would always joke when they ate them all up anyway. Nancy and her mother exchanged looks. Then Nancy said, I'm not the only one Cheryl helped. She did a lot for the other girls too, especially at the center. She had all these big plans, you know, and she used to organize lots of things at the center for young people. Then she quit. She changed real sudden. I never knew why. Oh, she'd still help people, but she wouldn't go out of her way anymore. And then she met that creep, and he moved in with us. So I moved back home because Dad left. I appreciated them comforting me. I sat in silence because I could not think of nothing to say to comfort them in return. We sat in silence for a while before Nancy's mother said, Well, enough for tonight. You're probably tired. You go home and get yourself some sleep. Thanks for coming back and telling us about Cheryl. Nancy came over to where I was standing and hugged me. Then she said, Cheryl left some things for us to take care of, like the typewriter you sent for one of her birthdays. She didn't want Mark selling it on her. And the other thing is, well, you come back when you're feeling better. Tonight is not the right time. You will come back. It seemed important to Nancy that I returned, so I promised I would. When we were back in the car, I said to Roger, imagine that. They're so poor and yet they kept that typewriter for Cheryl all the time, when they could have sold it. And the way they talked about her, like they really did love her. They give out such a family feeling. Cheryl must have liked that a lot. No wonder she felt more at home with them than she did with me. I think you should come over to my place tonight, all right? All right, I'd like that. Cheryl hasn't been home for a really long time, but somehow the house would feel much more empty tonight. When I finally got to sleep, it was past midnight. I dreamt of Cheryl. I could hear her laughter, but I couldn't find her. I looked and I looked, but all I could hear was Cheryl laughing. And when I did find her, she was in some kind of quicksand. I put my arm out to reach her, to help her, but she wouldn't take my hand. She just kept laughing and sinking down, deeper and deeper. I begged her and I begged her to take my hand and I began crying uncontrollably. When I woke up, I was still crying, and Roger was hugging me. When I had quietened down, I laid my head on his chest and I listened to his heartbeat. A couple of times, the leftover sobs would shake my whole body, and Roger would hold me a little tighter. Gradually, I went back to sleep. The next morning, the police called and asked if I could identify the body they had pulled out of the river. When we returned a few hours later, I was in more of a daze than I had been before. It was final. It had been Cheryl. Roger did almost everything for me for the next few days. I was mostly silent, pondering the why of Cheryl's death. Once in a while, I would talk about Cheryl to Roger. Roger helped me with the funeral arrangements. Actually, he did almost everything. After some hesitation, I phoned the Steindls. I had a long talk with Mrs. Steindl, telling her of Cheryl's death, and explained the absence of our visits. She was very understanding, very sympathetic. That same evening, the night before the funeral, they came to Roger's place to see me. The funeral service was small and simple. Most of the people who came were Indian or Métis. They had heard about Cheryl's death through Nancy and her mother. They gave me an insight into Cheryl's past by the glowing remarks they had made about her. Again, I had wanted to cry for the waste of such a beautiful life, but I didn't. I remained outwardly emotionless. Nancy asked me again to come over to their place in the near future, and I promised I would. When it was all over and Cheryl was buried, I knew it was time to return to the house alone. Roger seemed to understand my need and drove me back. He didn't come in with me. Before he left, he said, Take as much time as you need, April, and then call me. I'll be waiting for you. Roger, thank you for everything. I love you. Roger smiled. I love you too, April.